cardiovascular physiology, meaning we know uh, so far that we know how heart looks like and how the blood flows through the heart. So it comes from the veins to right atrium, then it goes through the tricuspid valve into right ventricle, and then it goes to the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary arteries, which take them to the lung, and then pulmonary veins send so-called fresh blood. I'm using the word fresh, meaning oxygen-rich blood to the left atrium. Left atrium then drop it down to left ventricle through the bicuspid valve, and then left ventricle pump the blood through the aorta, like via the aortic valve. It goes to the aorta, supplying it to the body. So we know that part. So in other words, we know how heart looks like and how blood flows through the heart. Now the question we have to ask, like, how heart does that? Like how heart is able to produce that contraction. So now in skeletal muscle chapter, which is in ANP1, in skeletal muscle chapter, we learn, just to review that, nothing to do with cardiac muscle, we learned that brain or spinal cord, in other words, central nervous system, send a signal through their motor neuron to the neuromuscular junction, NMJ. At that junction, acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter which is released, bind with the receptors of the sarcolemma, meaning the plasma membrane of the skeletal muscle cell. And then the signal goes to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which releases calcium ion. Calcium ion bind with a protein molecule called troponin. So troponin, when bind with calcium, they move the tropomyosin. When tropomyosin move, the active side of the G-actin got exposed, which bind with the myosin head, and myosin head pull, and that's a contraction. This whole thing we learned in ANP1, that how skeletal muscle contract. So if you forgot that, go to any like I would, my suggestion would be go to YouTube and type skeletal muscle contraction animation. There will be thousands of them will pop up. Okay. So in other words, the central nervous system send a signal, and therefore skeletal muscle work. In case of cardiac muscle, they're a little bit specialized. They do not depend on the central nervous system, meaning central nervous system do not have to send a signal in order for muscle, cardiac muscle to contract. Cardiac muscle can produce their own signal. So that's the first big difference. So in case of skeletal muscle, they need a signal from the nerve. In case of cardiac muscle, they don't need. That doesn't mean the brain does not send a signal. Brain does send a signal. We're going to learn that later on. But they don't need it. So they can do on their own, which is why it is known as like autorhythmicity. I mean, automatically they can produce a rhythm of cardiac contraction and relaxation. So the cardiac muscle cells, they have two population of cells. The smaller population, we call them nodal cells. Nodal cells, they are specialized cardiac muscle cells that can produce that signal that we are just talking about. And the major group is called the contractile cells. Contractile cells, they contract. So they produce their biomechanical force so that blood can move out. So right ventricle send the blood to the pulmonary trunk, and left ventricle send the blood to the aorta. That can, and even the atrium can pump the blood to the corresponding ventricle. So those pumping can be possible by contractile cell. They can only do it when they receive the signal from nodal cells. So nodal cells is a smaller population of cardiac muscle cells. They are in the heart. They have the ability to produce the signal that, in case of skeletal muscle, sent by the nervous system. So that's the biggest thing to understand. The remaining part, like troponin binding with calcium, tropomyosin move, those part is pretty similar. Okay. So now let's learn how nodal cells does that job. So in the heart, I'm going to teach this slide right from this picture. In the on the right atrium, the like a little bit superior part of the right atrium, there is a group of cells. They are known as sinoatrial node. Means in short, SA node. So SA node, the nodal cells, there are a huge population right there. That's right over on the right atrium. That's a population of nodal cells. Then there is another group of nodal cells. They are located right at the junction between right atrium and the right ventricle, that floor. We call that atrioventricular node, or in short, AV node. So now when this, and then there's a third group also. They're all over the place in these muscles of the ventricles. Those are called Purkinje fibers. So these are the major three groups of nodal cells. There are also nodal cells everywhere that can carry that signal, but these are the major three population. Okay, so these are the major three. For example, like just an example to understand it clearly. So let's say Amish people can live anywhere in the United States, but one of their major population is located a little bit, if I'm not wrong, like somewhere in Pennsylvania, and maybe a little bit on the South Delaware area. So that's their main population. Same thing here. They can be anywhere, but their major population, three groups: SA node, AV node, Purkinje fibers. Now, what are these cells? These cells can generate their own signal. It's like generator. Like if in your household, we live in, let's say we live in city or Long Island. In the city, the Con Edison send the electrical signal to your house. In Long Island, the so-called LIPA, which is now PSEG, Long Island, they send the electricity to your house. But some household, they can have generator to produce their own electricity. So they don't need to depend on the PSEG during difficult times. So let's say during Sandy or any other storm, there is no electricity sent by the PSEG because their lines are broken. So you can generate your own electricity because you have a generator. Same thing here. They don't have to depend on the nerve because they can produce their own signal. The SA node, they produce the maximum number of signal per minute compared to AV and compared to Purkinje fiber. That is why SA node, they set up the rhythm of the heart, and it is known as pacemaker cell. They set up the pace of the heart, like how heart will beat every minute. So we know approximately like an average, the heart beats like 70, 75 times per minute. So that many signal the SA node is creating per minute. So SA node is commonly known as pacemaker cell for the heart. So when they produce a signal, okay, doesn't matter how many they're producing, when they produce a signal, that signal carries through all these cells. We commonly call them internodal pathway, meaning between these two nodes, the pathway we call internodal pathway. So these arrows indicating those signal going through all the contractile cells throughout the atria and come back right here. So this is better picture to explain. So right here, the SA node, when they produce the signal, this purple color indicating that the signal is traveling through the entire atria. Signal is traveling through the entire atria, and they come finally right here. the signal, this is the part that we need to understand, the signal cannot go through here. They cannot go through any other place. If they want to travel to the ventricle, they have to go through this AV node. It's kind of like, if you imagine this, if we go from Queens to city, you cannot go through anywhere else. You have to go through Midtown Tunnel. You have to, let's imagine there's only one tunnel that connects the Queens to the city. So you have to go through Midtown Tunnel. So that's same thing here. You cannot just travel, the signal just cannot travel anywhere. They have to travel through the AV node right here. So from SA node to AV node, when the signal travels, it takes approximately 50 milliseconds. 1 millisecond is 1,000th of a second. 1,000th of a second is 1 millisecond. So 50 milliseconds, so literally fraction of a second, they travel from SA node to AV node. And what they do, while they're traveling from SA node to AV node, they depolarize atria. So one thing now we have to learn that these are the two terminology you learn in ANP1, depolarization and repolarization. So cell, when they depolarize, the next is they will contract. Contraction means systole. So a cardiac muscle cell, once they depolarize, they undergo systole. A cardiac muscle cell, once they repolarize, re with the R, once they repolarize, they undergo diastole. So if a cardiac muscle cell wants to undergo systole, which is contraction, they need to depolarize first. So this signal depolarizes them. And it takes only 50 milliseconds. So SA node, through the internodal pathway, it comes right here to the AV node, and it took only 50 milliseconds, and atria depolarize. So now what will happen next? Once atria depolarize, atria will contract. So when atria contract, blood goes through these two AV valves into the ventricle. So from tricuspid opens up, it goes here, bicuspid opens up, it goes in the left side. That's exactly what happened. And while that is happening, while the blood is going because of the contraction, the signal slowly creeping up from the AV node to the AV bundle, which is basically the branches that goes through the septum. Those are all nodal cells. Now, this is like kind of like a bottleneck. So there is a 100 millisecond delay over the AV node. In other words, like think about it. If every single person is going to Manhattan and they're driving through Midtown Tunnel, so no matter when you go, there is always a bottleneck of traffic, because many cars coming from multiple directions, but there's only one way to go. So from Midtown Tunnel, you go to Manhattan. So that's why all the tunnel, you have all the traffic all the time. Same thing here. All the signal is going through the AV node, so that bottleneck will make a delay. And that 100 millisecond delay has a physiological advantage in this case. Why? Because we know ventricle is stronger pump than atria. Remember, right after this, atria will be, ventricle will be polarized, and once ventricle is depolarized, they are going to contract. When ventricle contract, the valves are closed. So if the ventricle and atria contract at the same time, the atria contraction will not result in anything. So atria wants to complete their contraction before even ventricle begins. So this 100 millisecond delay will be extremely helpful in this case. So they have a physiological advantage here. Midtown Tunnel 100 milliseconds delay, 100 hours delay has no physiological advantage, but here we have a physiological advantage. Then the remaining is very simple. They go through the bundle. There's a two branch. One goes to the right side, we call right bundle branch or heavy bundle right, and the one goes to the left side and then go through the Purkinje fibers. The entire ventricle now depolarize. So once the ventricle depolarize, then ventricle undergoes systole, meaning ventricle will contract, and the blood will go corresponding vessel, meaning when right ventricle contract, the blood goes into the pulmonary trunk. When the left ventricle contract, the blood goes into the aorta because these valves are closed. And that's the electrical signal. That is how the nodal cells help contractile cells to produce contraction. The final part requires 75 milliseconds. So 150 plus 75, total 225 milliseconds. So the final part requires 75. So first part requires 50 milliseconds, then 100 millisecond delay, 150, then 75 here, total 225 milliseconds it's required. That's the requirement for the electrical signal. Now, this is basically the same electrical signals they are explaining how the blood is moving. So the blood is moving with the electrical signal, and the graph is producing that electrical signal can be noted by the graph paper. We can discuss that right from here. So what happened is all this electrical signal, when picked up by a machine and indicating these waves like structure, because depending on how the electrical signal travel through, the machine can produce these deflection waves. These are called deflection waves. So they are they're recorded on a graphical paper. We call them electrocardiogram or ECG. So ECG or electrocardiogram, some book will call EKG because this is first developed in Germany, and they spell cardio with a K. So electrocardiogram, ECG, is nothing but the electrical activity of heart. It has nothing to do, pay attention to this one, it has nothing to do with heart attack. Okay? It is showing the electrical activity of the heart, whether heart is receiving enough electrical activity so that they can undergo contraction. But when the blood is flowing, if one of the vessels are jammed for the plaque, one of the vessels are jammed by a plaque formation, then that may cause heart attack. That's a completely different story. So that's echocardiogram. That's the one that figure out whether those blood vessels are opened or not. But here it is electrocardiogram, or ECG or EKG. This gives you the basic fundamental concept of whether the electrical activity of the heart is working or not. Okay. So now when we looked at the graph, their rhythmic pattern. So the first is the P wave. The second huge wave we call QRS complex, and the final wave we call T wave. So P wave is when atria depolarize. So the P wave is generated when the signal going through from SA node to AV node, the P wave is generated. And then when the signal is going through the ventricle, then the QRS. So when the signal is going through the ventricle, then this QRS complex is generated. So this is very important to understand. So the P wave is when the atria depolarize. So what will happen after atria depolarize? Once the atria depolarize, atria will undergo contraction. At the same time, the QRS complex is happening. A little bit later, remember that 100 milliseconds delay. So technically, it's a little fraction of a second later, the QRS complex is happening. So when atria systole is over, like atrial contraction is over, then atria is undergo relaxation. So that also produce electrical activity. But we cannot, in that electrical activity, we really cannot see it because it is masked by QRS complex. So that tiny ventricle relaxation or ventricle repolarization, you cannot observe in this graph because that is masked by QRS complex, which is the ventricular depolarization. So what happened next? When ventricle depolarized, then they contract. So this ST segment is like ventricular systole, meaning ventricle is contracting. And then finally, then they will produce electrical activity because ventricle is repolarizing. Then ventricle will relax. So now two things to be noted. One is you need to know the EKG graph is denoted by P wave, QRS complex, and T wave, and which one represent what? P wave, atria depolarized, T wave, ventricle repolarized, QRS complex, ventricle depolarized. And obviously those intervals means something happened right after that. Now, one very interesting thing to note. So the entire electrical activity from P wave to QRS complex to T is 225 milliseconds. Because right here, we just studied that it takes 225 milliseconds for the total time required for the electrical activity. But your heart is beating like after every approximately 800 milliseconds, if we assume our heart rate is 75. So in 1 minute means 60 seconds, and so 60,000 milliseconds. So if you divide 60,000 milliseconds by 75, you'll get approximately like 800 milliseconds. So 800 milliseconds is between two heartbeats. So one heartbeat right here, and the second heartbeat will be the beginning. The second heartbeat will be the beginning of the next cycle or the next ECG. So the heart is pausing right here. So 225 milliseconds, and then approximately close to 600 milliseconds, the heart is relaxing once the ventricular systole is over. And that's why this is a pause line right there in the EKG graph. So P wave, QRS complex, T wave, then a pause, P wave, QRS complex, T wave, then a pause, P wave, QRS complex, T wave, and so on. So P wave is atria depolarized, QRS complex, ventricle depolarized, T wave, ventricle repolarized. Atrial repolarization we cannot see because it's masked by QRS complex. So this is ECG or EKG. Now, okay, we got it. So we know the electrical signal happens. We know that causes the ventricle to depolarize, atria also. And then we know that ventricle is pumping the blood. So we are interested to know how much blood aorta receive. Aorta means body receive, because the rest really does not matter. As long as your body is receiving good amount of blood. So you can maintain your homeostasis properly. So you don't need to go to a doctor checkup yourself unless and until you feel bad or you feel sick, right? So same thing here. So if your body is receiving a good amount of blood every minute that is pumped by the heart, and you're maintaining homeostasis, you really don't care about what is happening. So we are going to focus on that. So that's basically cardiac cycle. So what happened is, so we are interested in something called cardiac output, CO, cardiac output. Cardiac output is defined as, the amount of blood aorta receives. Aorta receives means your body receives. So the amount of blood that enter aorta in a minute. Amount of blood that enters into the aorta in a minute. That's an interesting, that's the way to look at the cardiac output. So amount of blood entering into the aorta per minute. So first thing you need to know that how many times blood enter into the aorta. That means that many times the heart contracts. So if your heart rate is, let's say 70 times per minute, let's assume your heart rate is 70 times per minute. That means 70 times blood enters into the aorta per minute. Now you need to know how much each time they go. That value, how much each time, how much each stroke can get the blood into the aorta, is called stroke volume, SV, stroke volume. So cardiac output literally is CO equals SV, stroke volume, times HR, heart rate. So every time when your heart contracts, every time when ventricle contracting, they send some blood into the aorta. The amount of blood that's sent every time is called stroke volume, like each stroke. So if you contract 70 times, you multiply by 70. If you contract 72 times, you multiply by 72. If you contract 80 times, multiply by 80, and so on. That means you multiply that by heart rate. So stroke volume, when you multiply by heart rate, you get cardiac output. And that is actually happening here. This is the picture of one cycle, and that happening that many cycles, meaning if you have 70 cycles per minute, this is happening 70 times. So each time, each cycle takes approximately like 800 milliseconds. Why they are saying 800? Because they're assuming your heart will beat 75 times per minute. So 60,000 milliseconds divided by 75 is 800. Now, then at 0 second, at the beginning, atria undergo systole. So initially the first 50 millisecond atria will depolarize, and then atria will undergo contraction. The remaining time, atria is relaxing. Same thing with ventricle. As soon as the atria systole is over, blood is right here in the ventricle. Now ventricle first half, they are depolarizing, that QRS complex we just learned, and then ventricle undergoes systole. So ventricle undergo contraction. The word systole means contraction, diastole means relaxation. Once ventricle undergoes systole, the blood goes into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk respectively. From left ventricle, it goes into the aorta. From right ventricle, it goes into the pulmonary trunk, and then ventricle relax. Then ventricle and atrium both relaxing until that pause is over, and the new cycle begins. But only one thing here is not right, is basically when ventricle ejecting their blood, when ventricle undergoes systole, they send the blood into the corresponding arteries. So left ventricle, once again, send it to aorta. The right ventricle send it to the pulmonary artery. This picture showing all the 100% blood went into that. That's actually not true. So they cannot send 100% blood into these arteries. There is a little bit remaining. We need to know that later on. So 100% blood cannot get into the aorta or pulmonary trunk. There are some amount remain in the ventricle. Okay, we will talk about that later on. So this, in the cardiac cycle, whatever has happened is written down here, or you can study from right here. The same thing. This one is explaining right there. So initially ventricle fill, because the atria pump the blood, it goes into the ventricle. So ventricles during diastole, ventricles fill. Then ventricle pressure keep rising. AV valve close. So all the AV valves close, bicuspid and tricuspid close. Then ventricle pump the blood. So as the valves are closed, the blood goes to the respective arteries. And that's exactly what they're saying. And then the ventricle undergo diastole, means ventricle relax. So slowly that pressure will drop, the valves open up, the bicuspid and tricuspid opens up, and the filling of the ventricle starts. Because even before atria, you have to understand this, most of the time in our life, we're standing up. So there's a gravity. So even before your atria pushing the blood into the ventricle is filling up anyway, because all these valves are open. So that's cardiac cycle. So the final stage of this cardiovascular physiology that you got to know is that stroke, that the one that I just mentioned, cardiac output CO equals to stroke volume times heart rate. So now the question is how that cardiac output, remember that is the one that is most important clinically, because that is the amount of blood keeping your homeostasis running. So as long as cardiac output is good, you really don't care about anything else. So cardiac output depends on two things, stroke volume and heart rate. Cardiac output depends on two things, stroke volume and heart rate. So stroke volume is the amount of blood that enters into the aorta per minute. Let's focus on the aorta so it's easy to understand, because same thing happening to the pulmonary trunk. In other words, here they say the amount of blood pumped out of each ventricle each minute. The same thing, whatever pumping out, getting into the aorta in this case, which is approximately 80 ml. So approximately 80 milliliter of blood that goes from the left ventricle. Again, we are focusing on the left, but it's same thing happening in the right. So from the left ventricle into the aorta. So the question is then how much blood was there in the ventricle in the first place? Remember I said that 100% blood cannot just pump in. So how much blood was here? That is called EDV, end diastolic volume, meaning end of the ventricular diastole, which is from here all the way up to here. End of the ventricular diastole, the ventricle is filled completely, because by that time atria undergo contraction or systole. So that volume we call EDV. So end diastolic volume, that volume we call EDV, meaning end of the diastole, end diastolic volume, end of the diastole, the ventricle is completely filled with blood. They can hold approximately 130 ml blood. So you had 130 ml blood, you pump 80 ml out, so the remaining volume, the blood that remained after the systole, we call, which is 50 ml approximately, 130 minus 80 is 50, which is called end systolic volume, meaning the amount of blood remained in the ventricle at the end of ventricular systole. So there are three things to understand here. End diastolic volume, end of the diastole, the ventricle is completely filled. Then the contract, some amount of blood goes into the aorta, same thing right side, and the remaining a little bit. So if I subtract the remaining amount from the end of diastole volume, meaning when the ventricle is filled, this is the amount that we get into the aorta. So SV equals EDV minus ESV. In other words, like let's say you earn some money, you earn $500 per week, you spend $400 per week, so you save $100. So you earn $500, which is EDV in this case, and then you save $100. That means that's the ESV, your savings. So how much you already spent? 500 minus 100, 400 you spent. That's the amount that went into the aorta. So if I ask you like the question, like which factors now determine stroke volume? In other words, which factor determining your spending? You say, okay, it depends on my income and it depends how much I save. So your income is 500, you're saving 100, so your spending is 400. Now, if your income goes up, obviously if the saving remains same, if your income goes up, this will go up because that means you will spend more. So let's say next month you make $600, but your saving is still 100. So now you're spending $500 instead of 400. So this goes up. So in other words, if EDV goes up, SV goes up. Same thing, if your savings goes up, your spending must go lower. So if ESV goes up, then SV go down. So this is basic, simple math. So when your EDV is up, SV up. When your ESV is up, SV down. Same thing as your income. Okay. So now if somebody asks you on what factor SV depends, your answer should be, it depends on EDV and ESV. So these are the two things that control the stroke volume. So the next question is like, what are the factors that controlling EDV and what are the factors that controlling ESV? Later on, you could go through the slide. EDV is controlled by two factors. Mainly, there are other interrelated, but two factors mainly. One is called venous return, like how much blood vein is returning. And the other one is called preload, like basically same thing, like how much preload it is. On the other hand, ESV depends on afterload and contractility. So these are the two different words. So EDV, one more time, venous return and preload. ESV, afterload and contractility. So let's focus on each word now. So venous return, like how much blood vein returning to the right atrium. That same amount will go to the right ventricle. That same amount will come back to the left atrium. That same amount goes to the left ventricle. So the venous return, if when return more blood will go out. That is actually called Frank-Starling law of heart. I mentioned in some slides right there, maybe. Frank-Starling law of heart, meaning higher the stroke volume, higher the EDV, or in other words, EDV is more, stroke volume is more. So let's learn it first. So more blood come in, more blood will go out. So in very easy way, we can say this: more in equal more out. More in equal more out. More money you make, more money you spend. So more in equal more out. Frank-Starling law of heart. That's venous return. Like that much blood when is returning. Now, what is preload? In order to understand the preload is basically if we understand if you understand like an elastic band. Let's talk about the elastic band. So elastic, we know, have the ability to come back to the original position. So if I take an elastic band and if I stretches that band and if I let it go, so if I take an elastic band, if I stretch that band and then let it go, the band will snap back. The band will snap back. Now, if I take the same elastic band and let it go it stretches a little bit more and then let it go, it will snap back at the greater force. Same thing as the preload. So in the ventricular myocardium, it goes like this, like they have more return, more blood came in, so the more stretches, they snap back with the more force. That's called preload. So when there is a higher preload, higher output will be there. So the ventricle stretches more, they will snap back. But there is a limitation. You cannot just keep stretching an elastic band because if you stretch after some time, it will not even coming back. Same thing applicable here. So there is a limitation of the preload. On the other hand, ESV is the contractility. Contractility means ability of the myocardium, how good myocardium that you have. So it's like the question goes to the elastic, like how good elastic band do you have? Not every elastic band has the same elasticity. The better quality elastic band, I'm just using here the term better quality, will have greater elasticity. So if you have a better brand, company's band, they will stretch back better way. Same thing, if you have a heart as a better quality myocardium, if you have a stronger myocardium, meaning you do a regular exercise and you strengthening your cardiovascular muscle much more. Like obviously I don't do that much exercise. My heart is always weak compared to Rafa Nadal or Djokovic. They are playing like 5-hour tennis with no problem. Very strong heart muscle. So their contractility is better. So higher the contractility, better quality muscle, so they will stretch back better. So your less amount of blood will remain in the ventricle. So that means ESV will be less. So if the ESV less, SV goes up. So there are two factors that affect contractility directly. From the name, positive inotropic factors and negative inotropic factors. So obviously positive inotropic factor increases contractility and negative inotropic factor reduces contractility. That's why the name. And those are the area where medicine comes in. So just to control your blood pressure, doctors gives you different type of medicine, which I'm not going to discuss right here, but those are the medicinal effects. Like how can they control the heart muscle contractility? And finally, the word afterload. Afterload is, this is a little bit understanding is required. Afterload is, let's give you an example first. Let's say I get a huge cut here. So if I get a cut here, blood is losing. So body does not want to send blood here. But it doesn't want, because we know that they're going to lose. So what they're going to do, they're going to do a vasoconstriction. So in the vasoconstriction, all the vessel contract, they kind of creating a back pressure to the aortic valve, sending that, hey, don't send me the blood. So that aortic valve has a back pressure. So afterload is that pressure. That means ventricle has to overcome that aortic valve pressure to get the blood in to the aorta. So afterload is the blood pressure in the aorta and the pulmonary trunk that goes right there. So that means they are opposing to opening these valves. So you need more pressure to open that. So that's what they will do. They will cut down the stroke volume. That means more blood cannot come in. So preload, preload, venous return contractility, afterload, these factors directly control EDV and ESV. Okay. There are a few more factors we got to discuss about that control the heart rate, like hormone and the nerve, which I am going to discuss when I